I am Benjamin Couch Payne. I'm a project officer with the Barney Charter School Initiative, and I'm also one of the founding members of the Anna Julia Cooper Public Charter School effort here in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the Alan P. Kirby Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship, which is the campus of Hillsdale College in our nation's capital. Hillsdale was founded in 1844 with a mission to furnish all persons who wish, irrespective of race, religion, or gender, a liberal arts education, specifically aimed at developing the minds and improving the hearts of its pupils. The man standing right over here, knowingly or not, set all the events in motion to have us here this evening, and he can also sing. So as a result, I'm not going to waste any more time. This is Mr. Roger Moss Jr., accompanied by Hillsdale College Jr. Lorena Clements on the piano, performing a piece composed by Margaret Bonds with lyrics from a poem by Langston Hughes, which is "The Negro Speaks of Rivers." Whew. And with that, I officially welcome you to the second annual Symposium on Liberal Arts Education and African American History, a tribute to Anna Julia Cooper. And now I turn it over to a co-founder of this event, Mr. David Withen.
Good afternoon. Right. So since we're ultimately talking about the classics, why don't we start this afternoon and see how many people have been practicing their Latin? Ready? Salvete. Oh, I've got a few. About kairete. I got one, kaire. There we go. It's hello in Latin and in Greek. Okay, so I am David Withen. I'm an English instructor at Savannah Technical College, and I have the great privilege of moderating tonight. And I want to start by thanking all the people who made this afternoon, I keep saying this night, but this afternoon possible, starting with Mr. Benjamin Payne. He won't admit it, but he did most of the work to get this together. Everything that we're doing today, it started in fact in front of an elevator in the school that he and I used to teach, or I used to teach at, and he used to be the director of. When he stopped me in front of the elevator after I had spoken at a conference somewhere far away from Savannah, and he said, "You know, that kind of thing, you would get this if you know Mr. Payne, by the way." He leaned in and he said, "You know, that thing you do, we should do that here." I said, okay. So we wrote the grants and called the people, and were able to have the first annual symposium on liberal education and African American history last year in Savannah, Georgia, and that was for William Sanders Scarborough, who I hope, and if you don't know, I hope that you will learn about him. If you do know, outstanding. And we had Dr. Michelle Ronick and Dr. Patrice Rankin of the University of Richmond and Dr. Michael Benjamin. It was an outstanding event. So we decided that we had to do it again this year, and it had to happen. I'm not a superstitious person, but I knew that it had to happen because everything that could go wrong along the way went wrong along the way, and yet I'm still standing here right now, including even today when Mr. Moss and I had spent 3 hours sitting at the airport while American Airlines did some paperwork to get our plane off of the ground. So we've had quite the experience. So please, a round of applause for Mr. Benjamin Payne before we get started. Of course, I also want to thank our sponsors, because tonight, or this afternoon, would not have happened without them as well. The Society for Classical Studies Classics Everywhere Initiative, the Classical Association of the Middle West and South, their Committee for the Promotion of Latin, the Classical Association of the Atlantic States, of course, where we are right now, the Alan P. Kirby Jr. Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship. They all provided the means by which we could make this happen. And so thank you very, very much to all of them. I also want to acknowledge some of our guests tonight. So we've met Mr. Roger Moss and myself and Mr. Payne. I do want to thank, of course, our speakers, and I'll introduce each of them individually, but Dr. Shirley Moody Turner, who is at the University of Pennsylvania. We'd like to say thank you and welcome to her. Dr. Carolivia Herron, who is from Howard University, also will be speaking tonight, and I'll introduce each of them in a little bit more detail. I also want to acknowledge Dr. Mike Morica, who is the head of the Anna Julia Cooper Episcopal School in Richmond, Virginia. And some of the students from that school provided, I want to make sure I'm touching the right one, I provided this collage of Anna Julia Cooper. So thank you for being here tonight, and thank you for having your students do this. Can I please get a round of applause? Outstanding work. I'm also pleased to say my wife, unfortunately, could not be here tonight. She is Vanessa Withen, though, and she has done, she has gotten me together, and so that's a good start. But she also, among her many talents, is an artist, and she painted this oil painting of Anna Julia Cooper specifically for this event, and so I want to thank her as well. If we could get a round of applause. She can hear you in Savannah, I hope. All right, well, let's turn to our first speaker, and that is Dr. Shirley Moody Turner, who is going to speak to us tonight about the education of the underprivileged, Anna Julia Cooper's commitment to transformative education in our nation's capital. To give you a little bit of background, and I have it on my phone, I'm one of those people. It is Dr. Shirley Moody Turner is a scholar, educator, and writer who has been conducting research and teaching on the life, writings, and work of Anna Julia Cooper for almost 2 decades. She was first introduced to Cooper's writings as a graduate student and found particular resonance and inspiration in Cooper's stated devotion to, quote, the education of the underprivileged. Moody Turner is the author of Black Folklore and the Politics of Racial Representation, in which she examines Cooper's relationship to early black folklore studies, and she has published widely, lectured, and given interviews on the reach and continued significance of Cooper's work. She is the co-founder of the Anna Julia Cooper Society, the founding director of the Cooper Du Bois Mentoring Program, and in 2017, she worked with the Moreland Spingarn Research Center at Howard University to create the Anna Julia Cooper Digital Collection. She is an associate professor of English and African American Studies at Penn State University and is currently a fellow at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University, where she is completing her next book, privately printed, Anna Julia Cooper and the Gender Politics of Black Publishing. So let's please welcome Dr. Shirley Moody Turner.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. No? Okay. See, I knew someone let me know. Okay, how's that? It's better? Okay. First of all, I just want to say thank you to Benjamin as well. Just a tremendous amount of work to bring this event together and along with the larger initiative. And I think it's just really, really exciting what you're doing with the Anna Julia Cooper Public Charter School Initiative. That was wrong, Charter School Initiative. And, you know, I'm just excited to see how things develop and glad to be here and to be able to be a part of it. And it's really great to be here with this group tonight. So many brilliant people here. This is really exciting. I want to take a minute and just acknowledge a few influences on the work that I've done. I think this is a really important practice. I'm going to give credit to this practice of giving credit from the Colored Conventions Project. I don't know if people have heard of it, but one of the things they do is always, you know, there's one person standing in front of you, but there's a lot of people who have contributed to that work. And I think, too, about the, you know, hashtags like Black women. We want to make sure that we're acknowledging the people who have contributed. So I just want to take a minute and I want to first say, yes, Mary Helen Washington was my advisor at the University of Maryland. She was the person who introduced me to Anna Julia Cooper. She did the 1988 Schomburg edition of A Voice from the South. And not too long ago, she actually sent me a biography that was given to her by Paul Philip Cook, who did a very early biography of Cooper, and Mary Helen passed that on to me. Paul Philip Cook worked with Louise Hutchinson on the Cooper exhibit with the Anacostia Museum, and that, to this day, is really some of the most incredible foundational work on Cooper. A lot of what we are doing here with Cooper, talking about Cooper, know about Cooper, wouldn't have been possible without that exhibit and without Paul Philip Cook and without Louise Hutchinson and the Anacostia Museum. I also want to acknowledge Vivian May. She wrote a book in 2006, question mark, maybe 2009, called Anna Julia Cooper, Visionary Black Feminist. And that book is the most sustained treatment of Anna Julia Cooper's larger body of work. And Vivian May was a student of Beverly Guy Sheftall, who is the Anna Julia Cooper Professor of Women Studies at Spelman College, and Vivian recalls taking a seminar with Beverly where she got, quote, bit by the Cooper bug. And so once that happens, like, that's it. You're studying Cooper for the rest of your life. So hopefully some of you will have that experience too. And I also want to thank Howard University. The Moreland Spingarn Research Center holds Cooper's papers, which we've recently digitized through the work of Joellen Albashir, Lopez Matthews, McKinney Johnson, Adrena Eifel, and you know, that was a labor of love. And we pulled together, we did it pretty quickly, got the papers digitized, and now they're available to, you know, a global audience of scholars and students who want to learn more about Cooper. And I also want to thank my husband and my daughter who are here. They're also part of this process. My daughter helped me with the talk, gave me some coaching points, told me to be confident and brave, so I'm going to try to do that. That's it. So again, I know that was a long preface, but I think it's important just to recognize that this work is cumulative. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. And this is my clicker. Yes? Okay. Oh, okay. Let's see. There we go. Okay. It is hard to imagine today what was really at stake when Anna Julia Cooper in the late 19th, early 20th century advocated for a classical or liberal arts education for herself and her students. We have come in some ways to think of a liberal arts education as those courses we take in college while we are trying to determine what our real major will be. Or we might equate a classical education with reading the classic texts of Western literary tradition. And while reading classic texts is certainly part of a classical education, both classical and liberal arts education signifies so much more. Historically, a classical education signified a schedule of study that included grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, and a liberal arts education was focused on educating the whole person to think and lead and participate fully in the social, political, and civic life of a society. For Cooper to argue at the dawning of the 20th century for access to a classical liberal arts education for herself and her students ran exactly counter to the currents in the national racial politics within the United States and the local politics within Washington, D.C. Nevertheless, and at great cost to herself, Cooper persisted in advocating for an education for all, grounded in the liberal arts tradition, and in the process, she transformed the shape of Black education in our nation's capital. Born into slavery in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1858, Anna Julia Cooper rose to prominence by century's end as one of the most influential voices on racial and gender equality in the United States. She was a nationally and internationally renowned speaker, author, community advocate, and educator whose work included her 1892 collection of essays, A Voice from the South, and challenged systems of oppression and sought to improve the lives of African Americans. As a child, she attended St. Augustine's Normal and Collegiate Institute before going on to earn a BA and MA in mathematics at Oberlin College. She taught for almost 4 decades at Dunbar High School, serving as principal for 5 of those years, and in 1925, she became only the 4th Black woman in the U.S. to earn her PhD when she completed and defended her dissertation at the University of Paris-Sorbonne. At age 72, she took on the presidency of Frelinghuysen University, a group of community schools for Washington, D.C.'s Black working-class residents. When she retired from her position as president in 1940, she continued to serve as the Institute's registrar until well into her 90s. Cooper lived until 1964, 105 years, almost all of which she devoted to advancing educational opportunities for African Americans. But Cooper's life story is so much more than an accumulation of dates and facts. It is not just what she did, but it is how she did it, at what cost, and to what ends. It is not just what she accomplished, but what she overcame and what she made possible for others. Indeed, at 9 years of age, Cooper entered St. Augustine's Normal and Collegiate Institute in Raleigh, North Carolina, and it could be said that that is where she staged one of her earliest protests against the educational disparities she would go on to confront throughout her life. Founded in 1867 under the auspices of the Freedmen's Bureau and the Episcopal Church, St. Augustine's offered African Americans in Raleigh and surrounding areas access to both vocational and liberal arts training. This access, however, was not without its gender disparities, and Cooper had to petition for admittance into St. Augustine's courses in Greek and Latin, a protest she would successfully enact again when she found herself shut out of the, quote, gentlemen's courses when she arrived at Oberlin College several years later. Cooper recalls of her time at St. Augustine's, quote, "A boy had only to declare a floating intention to study theology, and he could get all the support and courage and stimulus he needed, while a self-supporting girl had to struggle on by teaching in the summer and working after school hours to keep up with her board bills and actually to fight her way against positive discouragement to higher education." So here, Cooper identifies two critical impediments to her educational advancement. One, the attempts to restrict her access to a full curriculum, and two, the lack of structural and particularly financial support for her educational pursuits. These two things will be critical in shaping her intellectual and activist agenda as she worked to pursue advanced educational opportunities for herself and others. And I want to pause here to note that it was not just that Cooper was protesting the fact that she herself had to work after hours and summers and to serve as a pupil teacher at age 10, but it was also, as she points out, the sacrifices that were made at home. In particular, those of her mother, Hannah Stanley, who Cooper states, even after emancipation, was not, quote, released from self-sacrifice, and many an unbuttered crust was eaten in silent content that she might eke out enough from her poverty to send her young folks off to school. So later in life, when Cooper addresses the all-black male clergy of the Protestant Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., she is not speaking in mere abstraction when she states, "To be plain, I mean, let money be raised and scholarships be founded in our colleges and universities for self-supporting, worthy young women to offset and balance the aid that can always be found for a boy who will take theology." And she concludes, "Not the boys less, but the girls more." This pattern of protesting structural inequalities and advocating for social change and transformation will continue as Cooper translated her personal struggles to gain an equal education into her work as an intellectual, activist, teacher, and administrator. In 1887, she moved to Washington, D.C. to accept a position teaching mathematics and science at Washington's only black high school, the Washington Colored High School, known affectionately as M Street, and renamed Dunbar High School in 1917 in honor of poet Paul Laurence Dunbar. Founded in 1870, only 3 years after Howard University, M Street was the preeminent secondary school for black education in the country. It offered rigorous liberal arts education along with vocational training to prepare its graduates for trade jobs, careers as teachers, and most notably for pursuits in higher education. In 1902, at 44 years of age, Cooper became the 7th principal of M Street High School. When Cooper claimed her position as principal of M Street, the racial climate locally as well as nationally was fraught. It had only been 6 years since Plessy v. Ferguson had upheld racial segregation in public accommodation, including schools, and it would be another 52 years before Brown v. Board of Education would make segregation of public schools unconstitutional. So the entirety of her career in public education takes place under the shroud of legalized racial segregation. Add to this a shifting racial climate in the U.S. that saw the political and civic gains of Reconstruction met with a resurgence of racial violence and the withdrawal of federal support for protecting the rights and lives of African Americans. Indeed, this is the era that saw the ascendancy of Booker T. Washington and his Tuskegee model for industrial education. Washington's accommodationist approach, which emphasized training blacks for vocational and trade jobs, found enthusiastic supporters among white philanthropists and became the dominant, though not exclusive, model for black education. Running counter to this current, Cooper, in her position as principal, continued and expanded M Street's tradition of encouraging higher education among its students. As one of Cooper's early biographers, Paul Philip Cook, explains, Cooper succeeded in doing what white public schools in Washington, D.C. had not. She prepared her students to pass the entrance exams and gain admittance and scholarships to the top universities in the country. Under her leadership, M Street sent students to Harvard, Brown, Oberlin, Yale, Amherst, UPenn, Dartmouth, and Radcliffe, as well as prestigious black colleges and universities such as Fisk, Atlanta, and of course, Howard. Her students scored the highest in the district on standardized tests, and her school, her intellect, and her administrative acumen received international acclaim when French scholar Felix Klein, touring U.S. schools at the invitation of Theodore Roosevelt, identified M Street as one of the most illustrious schools in the nation. In her 1934 history of Dunbar High School, fellow intellectual activist and longtime Washingtonian Mary Church Terrell credits Cooper with the transformation of education in Washington, D.C. Cooper, she notes, instituted a liberal arts curriculum, began placing students at prestigious colleges and universities, and earned accreditation for M Street from such esteemed institutions as Howard University. She did this in spite of resistance from the D.C. school board and the political machine that opposed liberal arts or classical education for African Americans, and she carried it out at great personal and professional costs. As Annie Easton, a former M Street student during those days, explained, "If you could smell or feel or in any way sense the aura of D.C. in those days, you would know that it only took her daring in having her students accepted and given scholarships at Ivy League schools to know that the white power structure would be out to get her." When, for example, the white director of Washington High Schools, Percy Hughes, insisted Cooper teach the colored curriculum, she refused, for at least the third time in her life, to accept for herself or her students an inferior program of study. Instead, she waged what she referred to as the courageous revolt against a lower colored curriculum for M Street High School. Despite her best efforts and the swell of support from the local community, in 1906, Cooper was removed from her post as principal of M Street when the board voted not to reappoint her. She was effectively exiled from her home in Washington, D.C., and she was denied official recognition as the educational leader she was. As she explained in a letter written from Lincoln, Missouri in 1909, "I served as principal of M Street High School for 5 years. In this work, I had the satisfaction of believing that I was able to encourage the efforts of higher development. I can only say that my labor in this direction met with appreciative recognition from the people I served. But they are lowly and for the most part voiceless. The dominant forces of our country are not yet tolerant of the higher steps for colored youth, so that while our course of study was for the time being saved, my head was lost in the fray." The M Street controversy, as it has more commonly come to be known, is often boiled down to a debate between W.E.B. Du Bois versus Booker T. Washington. This approach, however, diminishes Cooper's courageous role in advocating for liberal arts education for her students, as well as the ways in which her gender made her even more vulnerable, and the ways in which racism and sexism at the individual and structural levels work to forestall Black education and really to dissuade Black excellence, or try to dissuade Black excellence. After 5 years teaching at Lincoln Institute in Missouri, Cooper was called back to Washington, D.C., and resumed her position as a teacher at M Street. Though she would never again serve as principal, she continued to advance classical education for her students and to advocate for recognition of their achievements. In 1923, for example, Cooper put on a production of 2 scenes from the Aeneid. The production was exceptional for a number of reasons, including at the most fundamental level, as Tsitsi Jaji states, African-descended people were not expected to lay claim to the classics. Cooper's students' performance, not incidentally, focused on 2 scenes featuring Dido and set in Carthage, or modern-day Tunisia in North Africa. The African elements in the play are foregrounded, and as Monica Nduno explains, Cooper Africanized her production of the Aeneid by using Egyptian iconography in the set design and by highlighting references in the script to the presence and contributions of Africans in the Western world. As Nduno concludes, Cooper used drama as a way of informing students, performers, and audience about the larger contributions of Black people to mankind, especially at points of intersection with Western classical civilization, thus illuminating a common ancestry and showing Black people with a world history preceding slavery. Cooper was especially pleased with what the students and the community have been able to accomplish with such limited resources. Wanting to give the students the recognition that they deserved, Cooper wrote to W.E.B. Du Bois and sent him a picture of one of the students as Hecuba so that he might run a notice in Crisis magazine. Du Bois was editor of Crisis at this time. When Du Bois failed to do so, explaining that the photograph Cooper sent him was not particularly interesting and that he had, quote, nothing of real interest about the play except for the short notice that she gave it, and that the general public was not, quote, much interested in that, Cooper fired back. According to me, Cooper says, and she quotes herself here, which I love, she would do that, she'd be like, according to me, and so she was like, I'm a source of authority here. A thing of beauty cut from the classic contact of a people is interesting. Cooper goes on to remark that the students' performance, quote, illustrates some of the best work accomplished in the Dunbar High School. And she notes, our staging alone costs several $100s, which is a good deal for poor folks and amateurs. I trust you will give the readers of the Crisis an opportunity to judge for themselves whether our effort is interesting. Underline, quotation marks. And I don't bring that up just to point out that there was a tiff between Cooper and Du Bois, but it's really interesting, and I'm happy to talk about that later. But more to point out the degree to which Cooper was willing to go to advocate for her students. That her students could claim, participate in, engage directly, and transform a classic of Western civilization suggests one of the many ways their performance constituted an act of transformative resistance. As Vivian May asserts, Cooper held to the conviction that all forms of education should be sites of liberation, and she advocated a critical pedagogy where students and teachers would eschew models of learning based on rote memory, the uncritical reproduction of information, or facile imitation. Her students' performance thus served as an example of how Cooper brought education, activism, and art together as part of her social change agenda, and she sure believed that Du Bois should recognize this. While working full-time as a teacher, Cooper also continued pursuing her own education as well, but again, not without challenges and roadblocks. In 1925, she traveled to Paris under the duress of being fired from M Street to complete her doctoral degree. Though she had started her advanced studies in 1914 at Columbia University, when her brother died and she adopted his 5 grandchildren, she put her graduate studies on hold. Then, because M Street would not give her leave, she was unable to fulfill the residency requirement to complete her degree at Columbia University. With the assistance of Felix Klein, who had written that glowing review of M Street 20 years earlier, she transferred her credits to the University of Paris-Sorbonne, where she wrote a new doctoral thesis in French on France's attitudes toward slavery during the French and Haitian revolutions, which she defended also in French in Paris, the heart of French intellectual and cultural life. And that's another thing we can talk about later as well, is the degree to which Cooper was willing to go into this space and, this kind of seat of cultural, intellectual power, and to talk to them about what they needed to do to recognize how slavery had shaped their history as well. And her examiners, took her to task for it, and she took them to task right back. Later in life, Cooper would serve, am I missing? There's Cooper, that's her dissertation on the left, and there she is in her doctoral regalia on the right. Later in life, Cooper would serve as president of Frelinghuysen University, founded in 1906 as a group of community schools to provide continuing education for working Black adults in Washington, D.C. As Leona Gable explains, Frelinghuysen was an effort to fill a serious need. Out of the 7 full-time universities in Washington, there was but 1 Black institution, and a list of 88 part-time colleges and special schools, not one would admit African Americans. When the D.C. Board of Education refused Frelinghuysen the right to grant bachelor's degrees and funds became increasingly tight, Cooper appealed to the NAACP to support it. She felt it was the duty and responsibility of the community to do so. When they did not, She moved portions of the administrative and teaching services into her 2 Street home. As Paul Philip Cook states, Frelinghuysen served an important function in Washington, D.C. in its own right, while also propelling other schools in the district to make continuing and adult education part of their curriculum. As much as Cooper rose to prominence, as my somewhat brief comments today illustrate, she was still and always working from the margins. And while Cooper was extraordinary, she was not singular. She worked within a community of men and women, some of whom she closely aligned, others with whom she held productive differences. She accomplished much, but she did not win all of her battles. Racism and sexism curtailed some of her most ambitious projects. She had wanted to write a history of African Americans in Washington, D.C. Who might be better to write that history than Cooper? But yet she was denied funds for such a project when she applied to the Brookings Institute for support. Nevertheless, the legacy she leaves is greater than defeats doled out on the basis of race and gender. She honored the humanistic impulse and saw education as a vehicle to answer the innate longings of each individual for self-realization and the highest expressions of freedom. She believed that an awakening of the individual consciousness could give rise to individual and social transformation. She advocated for the ideological but also material support for especially Black girls and women, but for all people dispossessed from seats of power and privilege. She advocated for, wrote in support of, and utilized in her classrooms a pedagogical approach that pushed back against the dehumanizing curriculum of the machine age that relied on efficiency and rote memorization and was producing workers instead of educating men and women. She transformed Black education in D.C. by creating a steady stream of Black students into the Ivy Leagues. Sorry, I just lost my place. Also by creating community schools that put pressure on other institutions to create continuing education programs, and by modeling and inspiring at the very core of all of her work, education in service to the greater good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was outstanding. I can't wait to discuss that. Our next speaker is Dr. Carolivia Herron. Dr. Herron is a highly decorated and accomplished scholar and classicist with accolades too numerous to list in full at the moment, but includes the Elizabeth Stone Memorial Award, I'm going to mispronounce it, the Bechol LeSean Media Award, a Fulbright Fellowship, and more. She is an author and educator and the founder of Epic Center Stories. Carolivia writes fiction, nonfiction, song lyrics, opera, and books for children, including Nappy Hair. She has held professorial appointments at Harvard University, at Mount Holyoke College, Cal State, the College of William and Mary, and Arizona State University. She is currently a professor in Howard University's Department of Classics, teaching courses such as Blacks in Antiquity. And when we were speaking before this presentation, I was telling her how jealous I am of her students after I looked at the curriculum of her courses. They're really outstanding. She also hosts her weekly radio program, Epic City, which you can hear at 4 p.m. on Tuesdays on Tacoma Radio 94.3. She can be found seemingly everywhere and anywhere. There are scholarly pursuits happening in D.C., and Dr. Herron's family has strong and direct ties throughout our city, and particularly with Dr. Cooper, whose influence inspires Dr. Herron's work today. Please welcome Dr. Carolivia Herron. For the discussion afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I said. Okay, thank you. Okay, I want to start by saying that so many of the names that you use in your talk were household names. I grew up with my grandmother and her siblings and so forth. all knew Anna Julia Cooper, they knew Terrell, they knew Mary McLeod Bethune. It was like all the educators in D.C. seemed to be godparents to my uncles and aunts. So it's always weird for me to switch my brain around and say, oh, they're famous out there, but that's Aunt Susie, you know, they're close friends. My mother talks about being placed on the lap of Mary McLeod Bethune and different little things like that are part of growing up we're poor enough, but I guess you could say the black intelligentsia class, if you will, in Washington, D.C. And I also wanted to make a statement in honor of Ben. I said your name wrong the first time. Now I want to make sure I get it right the second time. Payne. That I know you did some work within a classic school in Atlanta, and there are some problems there. Well, I want you to know the city of Atlanta asked to purchase 4,000 copies of my book, Nappy Hair, and seemed to be rejecting the classics, having no idea that the book, Nappy Hair, was written as a part of my comparative epic class at Harvard University, in which I taught the Iliad and the Odyssey and all those kinds of books, because it's in the direct tradition of the classical epics. And so I feel like I have to say that in case it doesn't fit in somewhere. I want you to know that as a group. Well, I am going to basically tell you about my family's strive toward education, and Anna Julia Cooper will come in and out. I'll be ending with talking about the Harbor of Ethiopia, an African-American epic that I would not have discovered if I had not been inspired by Anna Julia Cooper. From Roanoke to Bridgewater, I had an ancestor, 1858, ran away from slavery in Roanoke, Virginia. She had white skin, so she didn't have to take the Underground Railroad. She used the Overground Railroad. She actually was at a school for white young ladies and didn't know that she was black until she came home unexpectedly and found out. And her white slave owner father told her who she was, that sort of thing. A compromise was made, mother and father, the slave mothers and the slave-owning white father. She was given a bunch of money, put on a train, went to Massachusetts, and lived among the Wampanoag people, Native Americans in Massachusetts, and made a decision. She was so mad about slavery that she was determined to turn her family black. She said, I have a little story called From White to Black in 3 Generations. And she essentially, she was pretty oppressive, it sounds like to me. All of her daughters married the cold blackest people they could find, and that's from whom I got my wonderful nappy hair. It's white now, but it wasn't always white. Okay, so that's the beginning of the story. She was very much into education. She was in school when she found out about her education, having essentially a classical girls' education, and my parents. Both of my parents, and my mother's side in particular, always quoting Latin phrases and things around me. That was a part of my life. My grandmother went to Harper's Ferry, which of course we associate with Revolution, with John Brown and so forth. That's where she met my grandfather, who was from Jamaica, and they married. Both of my grandparents graduated from college in the early 1900s. This is unusual for anybody in the United States, let alone a black family, to have 2 people graduating from college so early. And my grandfather actually was a professor for a short while at Storer College in West Virginia. They met at Hilltop House. Some of you may have gone there. It's still there, I'm told. And I have the white to black, the 3 generations. Okay. I was just listing some of the friends, Mary McLeod Bethune, Anna Julia Cooper, Eliza Pearl Shippen was, she's the one who created the deltas. She's like my mother's godmother. She's like a household name. Bessie Parker. My mother described crying, going to school every day because she had to cross a railroad track out in Kenilworth neighborhood here in Washington, D.C., and she had to go past the white school to go to the black school, which is now Carver Elementary. And thinking about, and her own desire, to be educated and outraged by, even at that young age, having to go to school in that way. My mother was a graduate of Dunbar High School and was there after Anna Julia Cooper, but knew all about her and of course had heard about her through her mother, my grandmother, as well, and learned Latin and studied Latin and was a Latin scholar there. And she even studied, I'm told, Anglo. She used to recite Chaucer, Middle English, to me and that sort of thing from high school. It was at M Street School that she met Marian Anderson. She met Eleanor Roosevelt, and you can read about that or see that. If you ever see my opera, I have it. I've made it into the opera of Marian Anderson, Let Freedom Sing, the story of Marian Anderson. This is actually the 80th anniversary of her, this year, of her concert on the Mall in 1939, and we're hoping to do something about that at Howard University in April. Okay, so I guess I want to finish my parents' life, and then I get to the Anna Julia Cooper in my life, so bear with me. My mother graduated from M Street School, which was Dunbar High School by that time, and got 2 letters in the mail, one offering her a big job, as they thought, in the federal government, and the other to go to college. It was Minor Teachers College, and her mother had always wanted to be a teacher. And everybody said, oh, if you go into the government, you'll make so much money, you'll be rich, you'll be this, that, and the other. And everybody was begging her to go for the government job. And she said she went into the bedroom and cried and cried and cried and cried. And her mother said, you know, you want to be a teacher, go be a teacher. And the whole family capitulated, as it were, and she gave up the rich job, as it seemed to them then, and went on to be a teacher and through what is now the University of District of Columbia. And I can just to finish up that story, she's still with us in the world. She's 94 years old. She became the super science teacher in Washington, D.C. And I guess one of the funniest moments of my life was when I was a brand new, newly minted professor at Harvard University, right? I thought I was hot stuff. I was walking across, the yard and thought, I'm really something, And then some kid comes running across the yard, Professor Herron, Professor Herron. I said, what? Yes, what do you want? Are you Miss Herron's daughter? I said, oh no, is that all this stuff I've done in my Miss Herron's daughter? He had taken science from my mother at Lafayette Elementary School and was thanking me for my mother. So it's like, that's what happens, You can't follow after some people. Okay, well, I surrounded by all of this education and classic education. My father was in love with epic heroes. I'm an epicist, if you will. My nickname is the epicentrist, because I'm always into epics and talking about epics. And even when I'm trying to talk about something else, I'm talking about epics. And I can remember walking, my first contact with Anna Julia Cooper was just walking by her house and seeing the area where she lived. Because on T Street was the house where there were lots of elite black people lived in. I didn't live there. I was like, second, third, fourth tiered. But they were like the Mayor Washington married into the Bullock family. The Bullocks were pastors of my mother's church, Third Baptist Church, superstars kind of thing. And I was considered smart enough. They had a daughter. I was considered smart enough. They would come all the way out to Northeast and get me to come play with their daughter because they wanted their daughter to play with somebody smart. So that was my experience of T Street. And so I would go up and down T Street, and Mayor Washington, you may know, lived on T Street, 508 T Street. I used to go in there and play with Mayor Washington's daughter, and that was a part of my life. So I was familiar with her name then, and there are a couple of scenes. I think of the concept of hiding in order to learn. This is if I may distill the Anna Julia Cooper in my life, it's hiding somewhere so that you could learn something. I went to Neville Thomas Elementary School in Northeast in Mayfair Mansions neighborhood, and when I finished all the work for all 6 grades. By the time I finished the first grade, I just sat in the corner for the 6 years. I didn't do much of anything. I had to, they didn't know what to do. There was no school they could send me to. And thinking about, and I want to jump to something you said, by the way, things are coming to my mind, you stir so much. My father actually had the highest recorded scores in IQ in Washington, D.C., and there was nothing they could do with him. There's no place to send him, no school, no place, no encouragement, and no money. He didn't want to be a preacher, and if you don't want to be a preacher, you had nothing. You had no way you could go for further. So that really struck me when you talked about it, and that his education was through the Dunbar High School, through that high education, very high education. So hiding to learn when we're supposed to be at recess, running into the school and sneaking up to the 6th grade room and reading the books that you're not supposed to be able to read yet and finishing them all up. And my mind was in a way was getting ready for the Anna Julia Cooper story, I feel, that affected me so much in the research part of my life. Because when I found out that they wouldn't let her learn Greek and Latin, which I wanted to learn so much. And I can tell you in my high school, Coolidge High School, our Latin teacher would not allow the black students to come in through the front door. We had to go in through the back door. The white students went in through the front door. And if you wanted to learn Latin, you had to want it a lot because you had to endure the insult of going into the back door. I remember trying to go in through the front door once. She just stood there and wouldn't let me through. But I wanted to learn it so bad that I put up with that insult and went in through the back. And she would teach Latin 4 days a week, and on Friday she would teach Greek. And I actually preferred the Greek, and so I would just wait for Friday so we could learn a little bit of Greek. And that was like a joy for me. Fighting to be educated. There was a person in a neighborhood where my mother grew up in Kenilworth, Charles Thomas. He was actually the dean of Minor Teachers College, another product of Paul Cook and the people you've been mentioning. Paul Cook is a good friend of mine. I visited him many times, and so it's just like, I can't believe you're talking about my friends. So I didn't realize that Harvard was basically a white school, because there was this black man on our street. Everybody said was the smartest man in the world. Okay, he's Dr. Charles Thomas. He had very dark skin. And there was a joke that I didn't quite understand about him, in which he would, there'd be a big occasion and everybody would wear their robes, and he would wear his Harvard robe, which of course was red. And there was an idea then that the dark-skinned people should not wear bright red. And somebody who didn't understand that Harvard was a prestigious school said to somebody else in the group, why would they put the red robe on Charlie? Because he's so dark. And it was like a big joke in the family that this poor, stupid person didn't know that this was an honor, and that in this case, the usual don't let black people wear red didn't fit. Well, I didn't understand any of that. I didn't understand colorism. I was clueless. And I thought that meant that you had to have really dark skin to go to the school with the smartest person in the world. So I remember sitting on the wall across from his house on Douglas Street and wishing I was really, really black so I could go to this school called Harvard. And that way I could go where the smartest man in the world used to go. I got to tell this story at his funeral and share it for the first time with his wider family. It was a lot of laughter about that. He actually visited me at Harvard one time in my office there before he died, which was also a joy. So this is all the background I want before I get to what did Anna Julia Cooper do in my life. I was told that there's no such thing as African American epic. Almost all the genres of African American poetry occur for black people at the same time as they occur for white people. And black people are writing romantic poetry when white people are writing romantic poetry, and back and forth and so forth. And most American epics are written around the Revolutionary War, and you don't find any African American epics around the Revolutionary War. So people said they didn't exist. And I just felt like I was really depressed. I felt like the epic impulse is everywhere, and it has to exist. And we'll get that back when I need it. We don't need it right now. And so I was sort of wandering around libraries and digging up old things, and happened upon Anna Julia Cooper's A Voice from the South, and read about her sitting in the back of the room, hiding under her table. I mean, she was learning Greek under a table, and these well, I won't say what word is in my head, in the front, with the table available to them, weren't learning a thing, and she had it all. And I thought, well, I'm just going to take this from her. And I remember just reading that, and it says, I'm making the decision that African American epics exist. I'm ignoring everybody that tells me it doesn't exist. I just decided it. I don't care what they say. And so now, okay, where is it? And so I started going to libraries, and I did, instead of saying, I don't know if this exists, and can I look at this, that, and I just decided that it was there. And I went to the rare book rooms in Library of Congress, and I got a wonderful fellowship to the Beinecke Library at Yale. Couldn't find a thing there. I did find a book, 1835. That was my first clue that there was something there. 1835, John Boyd wrote an epic in Miltonic blank verse from the Bahamas called A Vision. Aha! So if I feel a desire for this, other people must have felt it at some time. So let me find this stuff. So I couldn't find it, and I got this wonderful fellowship to Beinecke, went up and down everything, went through all the catalogs, nothing. And every day I would be in the library feeling depressed because I was spending their money and enjoying that part, but I could find nothing. I would pass by these great big piles of like card catalogs that said miscellaneous. Miscellaneous. I said, well, I'm not finding anything else. I might as well see what miscellaneous is. So I pull out the miscellaneous, and lo and behold, some amazing person way back when is just collecting epic poems from all over the place, 10 at a time, sticks them in a binder, puts them on the shelf, and calls it miscellaneous. And there are like 100, 200 of them. And most of them about white people, but I find like 20 by black people. And he just sticks them in there, and it's under miscellaneous. And I'm thinking, wow, and I found my stuff. And it was like, I think Anna Julia Cooper was there. I don't have to be a scholar. Like, I can be a novelist kind of person and say, I think there was a spirit there helping me out. And I couldn't believe the joy I found with finding these epics, and they're about everything under the sun. They use, some of them use Milton, some of them use Homer, some of them use Germanic epics, the Faust story as their foundations, and elaborating stories about African Americans. Many of them about half of them use Abraham Lincoln as a hero. It's almost as if there's a certain kind of sadness in this. You find them just struggling to figure out who is the hero? Who is the hero? And I have this picture in my head that they were sitting at a window, and escaping slaves are running past the window, and they're thinking, who was the hero? And they can't see, that the hero was right there among us and a part of them. So many of them have those kinds of stories. But can we get the I don't know what happened to this. The one I found at the end, by Maurice Corbett. Sorry about that. It's because I wasn't using it enough, so it didn't like what I was doing. Among other things, called The Harbor of Ethiopia. Not only does it talk about the history of African Americans and Africans in the world, I guess I can't make it do something? Okay, yeah, Maurice Corbett there. And if you look at it a little bit further, it'll tell you the heroic deeds of their leaders and ancestral progenitors, their trials and difficulties, all sorts of wonderful things, trying to tell the African story, the African-American story, the Ethiopian story, but also in the rhythms themselves, finally getting away from strictly European rhythms and using some African-derived rhythms, jazz rhythms, syncopated rhythms, that sort of thing. And it's just a wonderful experience to go from 1835 I'm sorry, it's 1910. Forgive me, I've forgotten the exact year. It's on there, and anyway, it's in the early 1900s. So this, I feel, is what Anna Julia Cooper gave me, and there has to be the idea that there has to be an African American epic. And if you actually, I don't know how to get to the page, but if you go back far enough, let me see if I can find it. You know, we scholars don't get much in this world, but the entry in the catalog, I'm sorry, I don't know how to, without the computer, says American, African American, and epic. That did not exist before my work. It's like, yes, Anna Julia Cooper and I did that. There, yeah, can you see it? The word African American and epic did not occur in the same place before this work. So this is what she did, this is what I did, and this is what I feel is the contribution that I feel like I've helped to make as a part of the tradition of insisting that there is a classical tradition in our culture, in our lives. And let me see, I think that is what I wanted to share with you. Yes, thank you. Mm-hmm.
Right. Can you hear? Oh, you can hear me. Okay, I know you can hear me. If anyone has a question, please, for either Dr. Herron or for Dr. Moody Turner. If not, I'm going to be selfish and ask all the questions. So I have a lot.
Mm-hmm. So if you have any questions, raise your hand.
Yeah, please.
Hi. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed both of these presentations. And I have a question about, for both of you, if you know this, but I think Dr. Moody Turner, if you could maybe answer first. What was the relationship between Anna Julia Cooper and Margaret Murray Washington? Because I know that they were both teaching. Mm-hmm. Cooper was older, I believe. But I'd love to, because I know you kind of drew out the tension between Du Bois and Washington. I thought, what about the women? Yeah. Thank you.
That's a good question. I haven't found a lot that documents the two of them in direct conversation in any way, but they were definitely in overlapping circles. So Cooper was working with, where's Nazira? The Colored Women's League in Washington, D.C., Colored Women's League. And I can't remember the exact name. They changed names, but eventually they come together and it's a National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. And so Margaret Murray Washington was active in that, and so they would have been working together on similar projects. So I don't find anything that documents any real animosity. What's interesting, though, is a lot of people one of the people have looked at is Mary Church Terrell, and have thought, well, Cooper and Mary Church Terrell went to Oberlin together. They're in D.C. This whole thing happens with M Street. Mary Church Terrell doesn't really come out and say a whole lot at that time, and why is that? Cooper actually replaces Robert Terrell after he moves on to a different position. She's principal right after him. And so, there was all kinds of speculation that they didn't get along or that they're husbands, but I'm hesitant about that because I think there were all kinds of politics going on, and a lot of the women ended up working together when their interests and needs kind of intersected. And I don't know that, for Mary Church Terrell, I don't know that it would have done much for her to say something at that point, to come out in defense of Cooper in that moment. And I find evidence later that they did work together, and that, Mary Church Terrell writes about Cooper as being this transformative force in Black education when she writes the history of Washington, D.C. But one thing, I'll just say one more thing to that really quickly, is that the period of the 1890s really sees this kind of foment of Black women's political and intellectual activity. And in some ways that gets answered. In like 1900, a lot of those avenues start getting shut down. So Cooper gets excommunicated from M Street. Mary Church Terrell is having problems getting her work published and printed in mainstream press. Pauline Hopkins gets pushed out of Colored American magazine by the same kind of Tuskegee machine that was behind Cooper's. And Ida B. Wells gets ostracized in the NAACP. And so in some ways, there's this kind of reaction against this Black way. I don't know if it's a direct reaction, but they end up having vehicles that have been open to them for political activity kind of curtailed. And they start looking for and finding alternative spaces to do that.
Thank you very much for your lectures. I'm really interested in the idea of the miscellaneous folder, and also in relationship to that idea of a miscellaneous folder and what you can find in that. In particular, Shirley, when you're digitizing the Cooper archive, then what are the other materials that you found, such as Cooper's autograph album, her
Yeah. If I may, they're the same collection that Mary Washington, what she edited, the 40-volume Schomburg collection.
Oh, Gates, yeah.
Yeah, Gates. I did one of the books for that. I did the one on Angelina Weld Grimke. And to speak sort of to your question, although it's not about Cooper directly, of those 40 books, 39 of them were books that were already finished. The editor just had to read the book and write an essay for it. Of course, the one I had to do was scattered all over Moreland, Rincon, and New York City and everywhere else, and I had to pull it together. And I really had to fight with Skip Gates because he wanted to call it the complete works of Angelina Weld Grimke. There's no way it could be complete. I was looking at the backs of envelopes and turning envelopes inside out and napkins that were from coffee shops. And I read all the letters. She's the first lesbian, as far as I know. I don't know if there's found somebody earlier than that we know of, African-American lesbian, where I saw all the letters, but she crossed out the she's and put he's in there for publication. Well, I didn't publish both versions. They chose to publish, the most recent version of it. But it's. I can say that I tried to get everything, but there's no way everything is there. And I've actually tried to get somebody needs to go there and do a better job so that we can call it complete. But it is not so. But you did that as well. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking when you were talking about saying, just making a decision that it should be there, so it has to be there. Mm-hmm. And that literally is a method. That's a method of research. Yeah. I've done that with Cooper a number of times where I'm like, she's working with Celestine Bouglet, who's this famous French sociologist, and there have to be correspondences between the two. Like, they have to be there.
They have to be there.
And so it's a matter of journeying to the spot and, looking in unlikely places, in archives, but also, in attics. And in conversations, just in conversations, thinking about the conversations you've had with your family and learning more about Cooper and the tests.
Oh, the more I hear you and others like you, if you will, there are not too many, I don't know if there's anybody like you, but, but you know what I mean, people are referring to these. I realize that the background noise of my childhood is a play, is a novel, is a book, is something I never realized. I told you, Mary Church, you fall asleep, and you don't realize these are people that are so important later on. And as I get older, they rise and rise and rise, and I'm thinking, well, yeah, she was down the street, and she was my Uncle Jack's godmother, and that sort of thing. I would love to have a drama that, say, of a coffee shop or I don't know, boudoir. Anyway, and have them all talking together. It'd be wonderful.
We have a project. I just want to say one more thing about your question. Because for me, the next book I'm working on is called Shadow Writings. And so, not called Shadow Writings, but it's about shadow writings. And not only is it a matter of looking for works that, exist outside of the published book, like you were saying, the work you've done on our autograph albums and the stories that they tell. So it's not only finding the items, but also the way I've seen her autograph albums before. When I heard you give your talk on them, I was like, wow. I didn't see all that, and so having new ways of reading these materials too, people say Cooper wrote one book, really, Voice from the South, but what about her scrapbook? Is that a book or is it not a book? Why can't we count that as another book? She wrote articles for the Washington Bee and the Washington and the Afro-American, and she cut them out and pasted them into a book, and the articles are all about discriminatory practices against workers, about this machine age production, critiques of an kind of rote education, and they're pasted over this book that's telling the story of the rise of Standard Oil and industrial capitalism. You don't think there's a conversation going on there? There's a conversation going on there. And so learning how to read these kinds of subversive practices that they're doing to get these materials. And then the last thing I'll say about that is, it's also about reading the stuff that doesn't even exist. And, when Cooper published his Voice from the South, 2 years later, Alice Bacon, the founder of the Hampton Folklore Society, said, we are so excited that Cooper has another book on the way.
Oh, no, that drives you crazy.
And that's
because you can't find it.
Yeah, and did she ever write it? Is it gone? The story of Washington, D.C. that she would have written, what would that story be? From Anna Julia Cooper, living her whole life, in D.C., but she didn't get the funding, and so she didn't write that story. So I think there's just a whole different way of reading Black women's.
Yes, and I have to add to that because before Phyllis Wheatley died, we were told that she had the manuscript of a second book. I have dreams of going through Boston and digging up her grave and finding them under her bones and bringing them back to life. It's like, I found it, I got it. And then I wake up and I'm just here in DC and it's like, oh no. And if you get the researcher's bug, you got it. And there's nothing you can do about it. You got to keep wanting to find it.
Ma'am, in the back.
Thank you so much for both of your presentations. And my question is for Dr. Turner, and it's two questions that I'm going to pretend link together. The first, so I think you mentioned being bit by the Cooper bug, and I was recently bit by the bug, and I've read a whole bunch of her stuff, and there were two things that stood out to me that tie back to as we're talking about education today. And the first one is you mentioned that she kind of rejects this rote memorization kind of strict way that school was taught. And the reason that is interesting now is when we talk about classical education, often what people are talking about is they think about the grammar, the recitation, all that, which is part of the classical education that Cooper espouses. Classicism and the liberal education, can you talk a little bit about that contrast between what she is pushing back again with what she views as classical with kind of what we talk about now when we view classical? And the second question is, I was really struck in her writings by how going back and forth, you have writings that very much fit with what everyone talks about when we talk about Black feminism, and then you have writings where she really elevates and praises kind of the sphere of domesticity, and I don't think it's just because of the period when she's writing, but she really views the home as this powerful tool, and I know she constantly opened her own home up to her students and extended education, but could you talk a little bit about the tension of how she reconciled kind of an education for women with this emphasis on the home, and then how she viewed classical education as moving beyond this rote memorization, even though we often talk about that in relation to the classical liberal education?
Two very, very good questions, big questions. So I think, we don't know exactly how she was teaching, what it looked like in the day-to-day, curriculum in the classroom necessarily, but we have kind of glimpses into that. And I think the play is a really interesting example for me of that, right? Like there's a way in which, okay, you learn, you need the kind of grammar, you need the language to be able to engage, but that doesn't mean that you are accepting that uncritically, right, or unconsciously. And so I think even looking at the play is like, okay, you're going to read the Aeneid, but what you're going to be doing is so different, right? And I'm not a classicist, so let me.
I need that play in my class. I need to take it.
But what she chose to like where you choose to focus, I think is really important. What elements you choose to look at, how she's seeing, teaching her students to read in that, the kind of do a kind of against the grain, maybe reading of that. So I think that's part of what she was doing. She also, which is really interesting, is how I came to Cooper was I was doing work on the Hampton Folklorists, and I found Cooper hanging out with a bunch of folklorists in Hampton, Virginia. And I was like, wait, what's Cooper doing in Hampton, Virginia? This picture, this kind of iconized picture we have of her didn't really fit with that model, and yet there she was, in Hampton, Virginia. And I love the story. She goes to a meeting of the Hampton Folklore Society. They have the president of the all-white American Folklore Society, William Wells Newell, is addressing the students, and he's telling them that soon they will throw off all of their kind of particularities, and they will join the great race of humans, once they can kind of get rid of all of that kind of specific stuff and just be human, be human race. So Cooper gets up right after him and says, you should appreciate that which is closest to you. You need to cultivate a respect for your own traditions, your own stories, that which is nearest. And she tells them literally, there is material here as great as ever inspired Homer or Virgil. And that is what is going to give life to your engagement, right? And so I think it's very different than saying, okay, you're going to read this and kind of memorize it. But she's really trying to think about, I think always, how they embody that space. And I think she does that in her writing. People, my advisor, Mary Helen, wrote one of the lines that says, Cooper was kind of, had this elevated rhetoric and was kind of speaking for, but not always to, kind of working class Black women. And a lot of people have kind of taken up a critique of that and saying, well, she's talking across multiple registers. She's always talking across multiple registers. Biblical allusions and references, her audiences would have, Black working class audiences would have gotten that, And so I think that she knew ways to embody different discourses and how to kind of speak across registers. And the home question, there's more? Okay, the home question. I think she didn't want to, and people who've read Cooper and know Cooper, you can jump in and, fill in. But I think she didn't want to completely collect. I don't think she had a centralized views of this is male sphere and this is female sphere. But I think she did want to say that there are distinctions, not that you don't move across them, not that they're kind of gendered binary spheres, but that there was something to be said for the work that had to be done in the home, that work was important, right? And so I think but I don't think she's moving always. I don't think it's like centered here. I think it's part of a very vast network of space across which she moved.
Sir?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yes, my question is short. Would you mind talking a little bit more about the relationship Anna Julia Cooper had with the classics? And here I'm thinking about Blyden, right? If you recall in his essay on the liberal education, right, he had a distinct view, right? Namely that, he preferred that to the modern view. So I just wanted you to talk a little bit more, about the specific relationship he had with the classics.
I don't, I mean, I think she saw it as really critical, as an important way to, I mean, I think she saw it in one sense as a way to lay claim to a certain kind of space and certain kind of tradition, that you had to have this experience in the classics give you access to different kinds of venues and worlds. But I think she also saw it as an important way to kind of answer that, what she called that singing something, that humanistic impulse. But I still don't think that, I don't think it was a completely westernized view of it. I think that that she had maybe a more critical consciousness toward classical education, but still, I think, embraced it, but I don't think embraced it unconsciously.
Yes, obviously, I don't know as much about Cooper in direct ways, but I know about her effect on DC education. So I guess I feel that's where I come into that question, because I'm the result of that education, and so are my parents. And I didn't say everything before. When I discovered the African American epic, and then I began to extend my discovery into African epic. I remember my first trip to Africa, I had to go through Paris, and I went and stood in the Sorbonne just to thank her. I just have to say that, this is because I knew she had been there, and her way to her PhD, and then went on to do the other. But I find that question reminds me of questions I get, like when I started my PhD at Penn, and I told them I was interested in Latin and Greek and this sort of thing. I remember one of my very well-meaning professor ended up directing my dissertation, saying, "Do you want to be the first black classicist?" And I'm thinking, what? You know, and we had been learning Latin. It was taken for granted that we would be learning Latin and Greek, and it's because of Anna Julia Cooper. We all learned Latin from, you know, I remember getting a taste of it in 5th and 6th grades, and then taking it as a regular class starting in junior high school. And the problem I have in answering the question is it was such a part of our lives that I can't separate it from just going to school. And so you're asking for specific information as if it was something unusual when it actually was run-of-the-mill, day-to-day life. Everybody did Latin. And it's because of her. She's the one who brought that. And I didn't realize that at the time, but it was a part of our lives. As I say, I remember my grandmother singing Latin songs as I'm sitting there doing my math or geometry homework, just running around singing Latin, and my mother doing the same thing. She has some Latin poems I still don't understand. I got to get you to help me out with it, that she learned and she recited Latin, you know, just like at some of the Ivy, maybe more than Ivy League schools, they have like the Latin speech at the end, you know, during the graduation. And my mother did the Latin speech for her high school, you know, and that was like normal. It was not special.
I have a question that I'd like to sort of tack on to that, because I think I heard some things that raised for me some of the questions that have been in my mind for a very long time and throughout this, and that's, so when we're, you know, you mentioned, for example, almost being dissuaded, right, in your pursuit of studying classics, and that's certainly it's a story that seems to repeat itself. And then you mentioned as well Cooper and her sort of her more global view of looking at heritage and history and classics, and so what I'm wondering is how do we create a just curriculum, a curriculum that integrates you know, Western heritage and things like this with the African American experience, with the great authors and with people like Anna Julia Cooper and Du Bois, and what does that look like, bringing those two together? Because that's what we're doing right now. And so I'm wondering, what does that look like now, do you think, to bring those two together at the K-12 level as well as at the university and college level? Yeah.
Well, we talked about, that sounds like yesterday's conference, doesn't it? We had a conference yesterday at the Center for Hellenic Studies, in which we dealt with these similar questions. And one of my responses is, you have some wonderful wild-eyed Afrocentrists that are going to turn everything black, that they're crazy off on the side. I love them, but you don't have to love them. But you don't have to go there. You can go to your normal, regular, classic people. They have all kinds of black people in there that you classicists, I don't know who's out here, you've never mentioned. And that's what I was saying yesterday, and that's what I'll say again. The idea that in Ovid, Andromeda is black. And I've never heard, and I've been studying classics all my life, and nobody ever told me this. And I asked my colleagues at Howard, did you know? And they said, well, yeah, we knew. And you never thought to tell us? Yeah. And it's just something that hadn't occurred. It's not ill-meaning, it's not racism, it's just not realizing that it makes it important. Now, I love the classics, whether there are black folks in there or not. I have to admit, I love it. But I'm delighted to know that there are all kinds of black people that are black. A whole black army went to defend Troy. Yeah. And it's not in some wild, it's not off on the periphery of scholarship. It's in the center.
Right, that's part of the concern.
So why doesn't anybody mention it? Why is it the classes don't mention those things?
Because it develops a place in the curriculum in the 19th century where it is European heritage. Mm-hmm. So now we have to pretend like it's nobody else's.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just reiterate that. I think, one of the things when Cooper did her dissertation on the French and Haitian revolutions, just putting those two things together, the French and Haitian Revolution, like the French weren't really trying to do that. They're like, European history is kind of separate from what's happening in the colonies. And so by saying, no, these things are completely mutually constitutive. Mm-hmm. So I think it's not just a matter of what is really important, I think, is diversifying the curriculum is important, and I think the work you're doing, it speaks to that. Like, there you go, now we can find African-American epics on there. But it's also the way that we read. Like, how are we reading these texts? How are we constructing? So it's not just a matter of diversifying curriculum, which is important, but it's also then, what is the lens? We can't just put them on there and say, see, we've got the Western classics, and then we've added a couple other things to that.
That's
1/12 of it.
That's a different issue, and we need to add things as well. But I guess one thing that struck me, I don't know what got into me to take on teaching this course, Blacks in Antiquity, because I didn't know any better. So I took it on, and it's like every week I find something new. Last semester, it seemed like every week I would come in with some absolute fact, and a student would say, well, no. Actually, I learned last week, and they were right, and I was wrong. It's like, I just felt like
Dr. Snowden's text for the.
Yeah, I used 3 basic texts: Snowden's, Bernal's, Black Athena, and Mary Lefkowitz to give a counter, which they refused to buy.
Wonderful discussion. Sure. Yeah. Okay. Please, more questions. Yes.
My question was for Dr. Moody. I recently discovered the book They Knew Lincoln by John Washington. Mm-hmm. And I thought about what you said about Cooper's desire to sort of write this history of African Americans in DC. Do you know if they were a part of the same circle? Did they know each other? I'm sure your family probably knew John Washington. He was a teacher at Cardozo High School. Mm-hmm. In the 1930s, 40s, I guess-ish. The book was published in the 40s. It went out of print. And then a woman by the name of Kate Mazur, who's a history professor somewhere in Illinois, got it back into print very recently in 2017. So I'm curious if they were.
I'm not sure. Those circles are pretty close. Yeah. So they might have overlapped, but it would be interesting to trace those two histories and see how he wrote that book, what kind of funding and support he had to do it. This woman, Hannah Wallinger, has done that with Cooper and Du Bois, kind of tracing the different levels of support they had to do their projects and how their careers kind of took such different directions and why sometimes people will say, well, yeah, Cooper and Du Bois, I mean, they're not really on the same because Du Bois was so much more prolific, but when you start looking at like where the funding and the support, institutional support, resources, there's reasons why someone might have been able to publish a history and someone else might not.
Thank you.
Okay. thank you. That's it. Thank you, you're wonderful, you're wonderful. Oh. Yeah, I look forward to your book going into publication. Oh, okay.
Thank you all so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to say a few words. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful discussion. I look forward to continuing it as we move on. I think the thing to point out is that this is a long discussion that's been going on for dozens, hundreds of years, and we're still in it. And the reason why we still have to have symposiums like this, the reason why we have to recall Anna Julia Cooper, I'm so thankful for these wonderful people for continuing her story, is because it's still going on, and that we still have an access and an equity issue in education. And even as recent as 2017, when a classical school with a predominantly African-American population is told that your curriculum is not appropriate for your student body. And that part of it is intentional and part of it is just not understanding. And so I'm quite blessed, humbled to be among all the wonderful people in this room and to continue Anna Julia Cooper's story through the Barney Charter School Initiative, through this charter school effort in Washington, D.C. No better place, no more appropriate place to push this forward. So thank you very much. Before you leave, we have another treat from Mr. Roger Moss Jr. and Ms. Lorena Clements. Another piece inspired with the words of Langston Hughes. Thank you. Before I close, I've gotten a little bit of credit up here, but I want to pay a special credit to Miss Ashley Frazier running the show here at the Kirby Center. So thank you so much for this wonderful event. So Anna Julia Cooper aimed at fighting for the rights of all, but particularly for those who have writhed under a mighty wrong. And she believed the most essential battle to be won was in the provision of such an education to our children, a schooling described in the following passage from her essay on education. Needless to say, in this quote, we're using the all-inclusive version of men. In a word, we are building men, not chemists or farmers or cooks or soldiers, but men ready to serve the body politic in whatever avocation their talent is needed. This is fundamental. No sort of superstructure can endure on any different foundation. The aim of education for the human soul is to train aright and to give power and right direction to the intellect, the sensibilities, and the will. Thank you so much for coming. Have a good evening.